Well, I've got with me now Paul Horrocks, who was for many years the editor-in-chief of the Manchester Evening News, covered many of the big national stories of the time. He was also a member of the Press Complaints Commission. But just looking at the list, Paul, I mean, these are some of the biggest stories that have ever been covered in the United Kingdom. The Yorkshire Ripper murders, I'm sure everyone remembers, the Moors murder and the digging up on the Saddleworth Moors, the Lockerbie bombing, the Kegworth air disaster when the British Midland plane went down on its way from London to Belfast. Just huge stories. Which ones really stand out the most for you as the biggest stories?
Well, you're right, those were some of the big stories, and I was in a fortunate position as the crime reporter at the time of the Manchester Evening News to go to some of these major news events. And looking back, I've got to say that the night arriving in Lockerbie when that plane had come down, and at that stage, of course, nobody knew that it was a bombing, although we quickly began to suspect that. But to see a hillside littered with debris and with the flashing lights of the emergency services, a dark evening, it was close to Christmas.
And
it was
mostly
an eerie moment that I
mostly British passengers. It was a British Midland flight from London Heathrow into Belfast.
Exactly. And that, ironically, it was only a few days later. And I remember being down in Kegworth thinking, you know, here I am as the Manchester Evening News, plain disaster correspondent almost. And again, a surreal moment was walking along the closed-off M1 with its wreckage on the embankment and bumping into Dr. Ian Paisley. Of course, he'd come up from Westminster to see whether or not, because the plane was en route to Belfast, that there might have been a terrorist element. You mentioned the Yorkshire Ripper murders. I mean, that was a story that gripped the nation. And going to press conferences in Leeds, interviewing parents of some of the victims. These are things that will stay in my mind forever.
It stays in my mind because there was a spooky moment, was there not, when the police actually played to the press at a press conference a recording which purported to be the Yorkshire Ripper himself.
I was there at that conference, and that was a man referred to as Wearside Jack, and we all thought in that crowded, hushed press conference room at Millgarth Police Headquarters in Leeds that we were listening to the voice of the Yorkshire Ripper, taunting, if you like, the police that at that stage couldn't catch him. Of course, it turned out it was a gigantic hoax, and years later that person was also identified and prosecuted. But yeah, those are moments like the Moors murders and the reopening of the Saddleworth Moor murders inquiry.
This is Brady and Hindley, of course, who murdered all the children.
Yep, and when the police returned to Saddleworth in deepest winter to begin their search, and then of course eventually brought Brady from the top security Ashworth Mental Hospital to the moors, and we got there about 4 o'clock in the morning to get inside the police cordon. And I remember looking through binoculars and seeing this incredibly forlorn sight of 2 or 3 police officers tramping through the snow with Ian Brady. And then as they walked towards us, we got a long-range telephoto snap of Brady, which was used on the front of the Manchester Evening News and made papers around the world with his terrified-looking expression.
But as editor-in-chief of the Manchester Evening News, what were the stories there that your paper really got hold of and led the way with, the big stories that you were in charge of?
I think there are 2 that stick out in my mind prominently. There was, of course, the IRA bombing of Manchester City Centre. And the aftermath for that was the police investigation, and it quickly became apparent that nobody had been arrested, and we began to ask questions why, a year after the bombing, was there no suspect, and was there no eventual prosecution? And it turned out that there was a prime suspect, but the police had chosen not to pursue that for their own reasons. We broke that story, we named that prime suspect, and of course that then turned the investigation from who placed the Manchester bomb into who leaked that information to the Manchester Evening News. And that led to one of our own journalists actually having to give evidence in a Crown Court case and risking contempt for refusing to reveal a source. The other story, of course, which had international ramifications, was the so-called Dr. Death, Harold Shipman, the family GP from Hyde, who we got an exclusive tip on that was being investigated for potentially murdering patients. And when you think about that, it's just incredible that a GP could harm his own patients.
And this was into hundreds. He was the biggest serial killer probably of all time in the UK.
Our first headline was Family GP in 20 murder probe, and that itself seemed incredible. But as you rightly say, it turned out he could have murdered over 200 of his patients and become Britain's biggest serial killer. We broke that story and followed it right the way through to his conviction.
I'm sure you could go on for many a long hour with all the great stories you've had, and probably some of the sillier and funnier ones, but we'll leave it there for now. Thanks very much indeed. Paul Horrocks.
Thank you, Gordon.